One of the oldest Buddhist rituals is that of taking refuge in the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. What we want to discuss today is how those relate to each other, and in particular, how it is that we can understand the Dharma as preeminent in this group of three. So I'm Doug Smith of the Online Dharma Institute, that's onlinedharma.org. If you're new to this channel and interested in living a wiser and a kinder and a calmer life, consider subscribing to the channel and click the bell down below if you want to receive notifications when I come out with new videos. So, taking refuge in the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha goes a long way back. It goes back to the early kinds of practices that the Buddha talked about. And there are many ways of interpreting what refuge means in this context and how we understand these three aspects, what are called the triple gem or the three jewels, Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha. How do we understand them? And so one of the ways to understand them is we can think of taking refuge in the Buddha as having some kind of confidence in the fact that the Buddha was awakened, or the Buddha knew what he was talking about. And we can understand taking refuge in the Sangha as understanding or having confidence that the Sangha, that the Dharma is leading us in the right direction. Taking refuge in the Dharma is leading us in the right direction. And the third, taking refuge in the Sangha, well, that's taking refuge in the broader monastic community, or the community of Buddhist practitioners. And that, again, is perhaps having some confidence that this broader group of practitioners or of monastics, that they're on the right path, that they're practicing well, that they're the sort of people that we want to learn from. However, it's not clear that the Buddha intended these three refuges to continue as such after his death. In particular, it's not clear that he intended the first refuge to continue as such after his death. During the Buddha's lifetime, taking refuge in the Buddha really meant taking him on as your personal teacher. So it meant saying, he is my guru, he is the person who is going to teach me, because I'm going to listen to him personally, at least in some respect. And this seems to have been how monastics and lay people understood it at the time. This also seems to have been, in a sense, how the Buddha himself understood it at the time. That is, as the Buddha approached death, he began to be concerned about this very problem. And in one discourse, the discourse that is given around the period before his death, the Buddha discusses this with his close attendant Ananda. And the Buddha says, "Now, Ananda, some of you might think, the teacher's dispensation has passed. Now we have no teacher. But you should not see it like this. The Dharma and Vinaya that I have taught and pointed out for you shall be your teacher after my passing." That is, after the Buddha dies, there's not going to be a teacher in whom to take refuge. And in that circumstance, the Buddha suggests a kind of change in perspective, to think of the Dharma and the Vinaya as being the teachers. And by Dharma, he means obviously the teaching that he gave to his monastic community, and who at the time would have worked to memorize that teaching, because it was not written down at the time, it was memorized. But also we should recall the Vinaya, which I won't be discussing in great detail here, but the Vinaya is the code of monastic discipline. So there wasn't simply the Dharma, the teaching about the Buddha gave about philosophy and life and so on, but there were also the monastic rules, which were exceedingly important, and which kept the monastic sangha going, because the sangha really would not have been able to operate without such rules. Now, parenthetically, this does not include the Abhidharma, and the fact that the Buddha doesn't mention the Abhidharma at this point is one of many indications that the Abhidharma is quite late, or at least somewhat later than this. If that doesn't mean anything to you, don't worry about it. Just wanted to point that out as a parenthetical. The Buddha at this time also mentioned taking on two refuges. And this is something that he didn't only mention right at the end of his life, he mentioned it actually several times in the suttas, at least that's how we have recorded it, in several times. But in any event, he mentions taking on two refuges. He says, "Be your own island, your own refuge, with no other refuge. Let the Dharma be your island and your refuge, with no other refuge." taking ourselves as our refuge is, in a sense, taking ourselves as our own teacher. And this is presumably because after the Buddha's lifetime, after the Buddha has passed on, he's no longer going to be around to teach. And so we have to be our own teacher. Much as it's said famously in the Dhammapada, that we ourselves must strive, that the Buddhas only point the way. They point the way for us, but we have to do the work. And that's the context in which we should take this message of the Buddha, that we should be our own refuge, that we must put our own effort into our work along the path. So we can see that in a very good sense, to take refuge in ourselves is to put effort into our work towards the Dharma, or in line with the Dharma. So again, when we're looking at this, even this duality of taking yourself as a refuge, taking the Dharma as a refuge, really both of them point towards the Dharma. The Dharma is the true refuge. Taking refuge in ourselves simply means putting effort into following the Dharma. And the Buddha also talks about how the Dharma can basically be our leader even when the Buddha himself is not present, even during his own lifetime. So, for example, the Buddha said, bhikkhus, even though a bhikkhu might live 100 leagues away, if he's not covetous for objects of desire, not strongly passionate, not malevolent, uncorrupt in thought, with mindfulness established, clearly comprehending, concentrated, of unified mind and controlled faculties, he is close to me, and I am close to him. What is the reason? That bhikkhu sees Dhamma. Seeing Dhamma, he sees me. Now, this is a relatively lengthy description here, but we see what the point is, that these are all aspects of practice in line with the Dharma. And the Dharma is then the aspect of life, the thing that we can recollect, which allows us to see the Buddha in front of us, even though the Buddha perhaps is 200 leagues away, even though the Buddha is not within our neighborhood. We can't go and speak to him personally. We can, in a sense, speak to him by practicing the Dharma. That's what the Buddha is saying here. In another sutta where the Buddha goes to talk to a sick monastic named Vakali. And Vakali says that he's not doing well. And the Buddha asks if Vakali has any regrets. This is the kind of question the Buddha would ask to people who were on their deathbed, essentially, trying to figure out what regrets they had so that you could try to work them out before the person died. And Vakali said he only had one regret, which is that he had been so ill recently that he had been unable to rouse himself out of bed to go and hear the Buddha in person give talks. And the Buddha admonishes Vakali at this point. The Buddha says, enough, Vakali, why do you want to see this foul body? One who sees the Dhamma sees me. One who sees me sees the Dhamma. That is, you don't need to see the Buddha in person. Seeing the Buddha in person is really unimportant. You're simply seeing this foul body. You're seeing a body which is an example of dukkha, an example of something that's imperfect. So when you're seeing the Buddha, or we should say what's important in the Buddha, what you're doing is seeing the Dharma. And in a similar kind of way, the Buddha describes in a separate sutta the way people revere and venerate King Pasenadi. And he says people revere and venerate King Pasenadi because he's powerful and wealthy and handsome and well-born. He's perhaps a Brahmin or Kshatriya. But he says, King Pasenadi himself reveres me, but he doesn't revere me for those same things. The reason that King Pasenadi reveres the Buddha is because the Buddha exemplifies the Dharma, and King Pasenadi is truly venerating the Dharma. So in venerating the Buddha, he's not venerating the person of the Buddha, he's not venerating the Buddha's body or his mind, he's venerating the Dharma itself. Or rather, King Pasenadi isn't venerating the literal body of the Buddha, but he is venerating what's called the dharmic body. Indeed, the Buddha uses the term Dhammakaya at this point. He says he's venerating my Dharma body. And this is a concept, or I should say a term, Dhammakaya, which may simply be a throwaway term, a one-use term here, but it's an obscure concept that has come to have greater meaning in the centuries after the Buddha spoke this particular sutta. It may be related to the idea of kaya sankhara, which is the body of the breath, or the activity of the body. The kaya sankhara is this bodily formation, which is taken in early Buddhism to mean the breath itself, because the breath is the formation of the body that the body does regularly, naturally, and that sustains the body alive. The breath is also, we can think of as the route to speaking the Dharma, because the Dharma would not be spoken if there were no breath to speak. So this is one option, this is one possible route that I can think of as to where this idea of Dhammakaya may come from. It may also come from the idea that there are certain kinds of valuable internal qualities of the Buddha that led to his own awakening or his own enlightenment. This is one recent doctoral dissertation has argued this, that Dhammakaya, this Dharma body of the Buddha, refers to these kind of beneficial qualities that the Buddha had. In any event, in later Buddhism, this concept of Dhammakaya or Dharma body would take on much greater relevance because it was taken to imply that the Buddha had, in a sense, survived his own death. Because even though his literal body had died, even though the Buddha said that he was no longer around after his death, nevertheless, this Dharmakaya, this Dharma body, this Dharma that the Buddha spoke, was around in his stead. And so, in a sense, we could think of the Buddha as still with us today. In any event, the Buddha clearly did identify himself in some respect with the Dharma. Now, we have to be careful here because there's an aspect of identification which would not be skillful. In particular, the Buddha would not have identified himself emotionally with the Dharma. This is something that the Buddha talks about in a very famous early sutta, the Sutta on the Water Snake, Majjhima Nikaya 22, where the Buddha talks about the Dharma being like a raft. It's a raft, it's a way for us to cross over samsara, the river of samsara, to the other side. And once we get to that farther shore of samsara, we leave the raft behind. We don't cling to it. We don't have an emotional kind of identification with it. Otherwise, it becomes, as we read in that same sutta, otherwise it becomes simply an object of debate and argument and dispute and anger. And that's not the proper use of the Dharma. However, the Buddha identifies himself with the Dharma simply by being somebody who discovered it and who expounds it and who exemplifies the Dharma in his actions, in his behavior, in his teaching, and so on. Now, there's one early sutta that purports, it says, it stems from a period right after the Buddha became enlightened. So an early period in the Buddha's teaching career, we might say. And in that sutta, the Buddha is contemplating respect or reverence, of having respect for things. And the Buddha says, he reflects that not having respect in life leads to suffering. That is, the life that is empty of respect is not a happy life. And I think we know this intimately ourselves, that if we have nothing or nobody to look up to, if we have nothing or nobody to respect, then we're in a kind of a depressive and sad situation. And the Buddha sees himself in that situation and says, he turns his mind around and says, whom should I respect? And he thinks of his own accomplishments, which are just recent at this point. He's only recently become awakened, enlightened. And he can't think of anybody to respect in that sense, because he believes that he has gotten beyond his own teachers, all the people that he knows. He believes that he has superseded them in their practice. And so at this point, he is kind of at a loss, because he wants to find something to respect. And so he turns his mind again, and he says, why don't I honor and respect and rely on the same Dhamma to which I was awakened? And so the upshot here is that the Buddha comes around to a notion of respect in which he is respecting the Dharma the way a pupil would respect their teacher, if you like. That the Dharma is, in a sense, his teacher. And so he is preserving a notion of respect in his own life, which makes his own life better, he says. It's less of a life of suffering, by looking up to the Dharma. And so we can see how, in a sense, the Buddha himself is taking refuge in the Dharma. And so, in a sense, our taking refuge in the Buddha is taking refuge in that same Dharma. And I would argue, in the same way, taking refuge in the Sangha would also be taking refuge in the Dharma, for the same reason. Because a well-practicing Sangha is itself going to be taking refuge in that same Dharma, as its teacher, in a sense. And this is an aspect of veneration, of reverence, of respect, that I didn't get across clearly enough in a prior video on that same topic. I thank my good Kalyana Mitta, my good friend Upayadhi, for pointing this out to me. And so here I am rectifying the situation. If you want to see that earlier video, which is excellent but leaves this out, I think it's pretty good but leaves this out, I'll put a link to it here up on the screen. If you're getting anything out of these videos, please check out my Patreon page and see if you want to join my patrons over there in supporting the work that we're all doing together here. Thanks so much to all of you, and be well.